Good afternoon, guys. We're going to tie one of my newest favorite flies. Actually just lost it about an hour ago swinging for some trout. Lost it on a big guy. He took me down around a tree limb and of course snapped me off. No name for this fly just yet, but I'm just about going to guarantee that you'll be able to catch trout almost nationwide swinging this thing. Uses a little bit of craft fur, a little bit of teal flank, some rabbit fur, and not much more, but we'll get into it here real quick. If you have any questions, feel free to leave questions in the comments below. We'll start off with using a Umpqua Waddington shank here. This is a 25 millimeter shank. Kind of an intruder style fly. Go ahead and put that in the vise. I've already pre-tied my trailer hook. The way I like to do it is put the hook on, run my fire line through it, and then put a little piece of junction tubing on there, or tube fly tubing. I think that really helps keep that line stiff and make a good connection with fish. I'm using 50-pound line there, fire line. We'll start off with a thread base here. And you got to kind of watch out with these Umpqua shanks, the Waddington shanks here, or Waddington style. A little spot where the junction comes together there, you'll see a return. What happens with the return is sometimes it can shear your tying thread, so just be aware of that. Okay, we've got our thread base built up. I like to go forward one more time and then back right down to where that return loop is there in the shank. And then I'll take my trailer hook set up here, tie that in. And I like to leave a good amount of space between, where I tie that hook in and where that hook begins. Now when you do tie this junction tube in here, you won't be able to replace your hook if it does become damaged or break. So if that's something that you're really keen on with your tying, and making sure you can switch out hooks, just leave that junction tube off. Now that I've got my length I like here on my trailer wire or trailer line, I'll just work that way forward. I always like to put my fire line or my trailer wire through the eye of the hook, or hook shank in this case, or intruder shank. Alright, put it through the eye of the hook. Alright, and then we'll wrap that back. And we'll snip off the excess here. Braided line really kind of messes up your scissors sometimes. We'll get that tied off. And even though nobody's going to see this under part of the shank here, I really like to give it a nice coating and make it nice and durable. Not many trout that can pull this fire line out from this shank, but if you hook into a salmon, or heck, if you even use it for steelhead, it just gives you a good peace of mind. And we'll take our thread all the way back to the back of that shank there. Alright, now we got everything set up. First material, we're going to put in some UV polar chenille. I like this in the copper. Definitely one of my favorite products to use on most of my trout flies. I'll put some form of polar chenille. Kind of depends on the color combination I'm going for, but I use a lot of coppers for trout. And we'll tie this in. I like to be a little bit overly secure on these tie-ins here. We'll tie it in nice and far forward, and then I'll tie it back. And looking to get about 5 turns on this. So I'll just get that covered up, and of course as we wrap this on, we're really going to make sure that we pull back those fibers so nothing gets really caught up. We'll do a couple more wraps. That looks pretty good. And we'll tie this off here. I like to do 3 wraps and then pull my chenille back and wrap right up tight next to that cord that makes up that chenille. And just gives me a little bit more security, a little bit of peace of mind when I'm tying these. One of the main reasons I decided to tie flies, several years back, was buying flies, and my biggest complaint was that they were always falling apart, and a lot of times the hooks weren't very durable. So I just decided to start tying my own flies. So if they fell apart, it'd be no one's fault but my own. So just giving that a little bit of a brush, break away any of those fibers that are kind of held up. You see we've got a decent amount of room left on this shank. I haven't tied the eyes in yet. That's something you could do, of course, before you put that polar chenille in, but I like to use bead chain. In this case, gold. I think gold is an excellent color for rainbow trout. Of course, Dolly Varden, like we have here in Alaska. And I'll actually take, instead of just 2 bead chain eyes, I'll actually cut a length of 4. Of course, I'm using some nice industrial grade snips here. What we do with this 4, so you can see these 4 here, that's 3 you can see, of course, but wrap that forward. And I like to leave about an eye length of gap so I can make my head, but also so I can wrap some rabbit fur. And I tie these on the bottom of the shank. And I stole this idea from Greg Senyo. Those of you that are familiar with Greg Senyo's products, he makes a lot of excellent tying materials, and I like the concept of the 4 bead chain because it kind of gives the fly a little bit of stability. So what I'm doing here is doing some kind of cross wraps. I usually do 3 or 4 on each side, then I'll do some kind of helicoptering wraps or base wraps around the bottoms of these, and then I'll make my way back to my polar chenille here. And as you can see right there, perfect example, I got a little bit too crazy with my pressure on my thread, and of course right at the junction of the return of that shank I busted off. So you can see that it's pretty sharp, so be really careful when you're working in and around that section. So what I'll do is I'll cut this off. Not a big deal, just get your thread tied back in and make sure you cover up all that thread that busted off, and we'll get tied right back in the back here. A little bit of trim of that thread. Next we'll use some teal feathers or teal flank. You can see the teal here, nice barred, kind of a zebra coloration. I like flies with some variegation or a little bit of animalistic kind of feel to them. That kind of gives a nice look like a minnow, or in our case fry and par that have some markings on their sides. Kind of gives a little bit more of an attractive appeal for trout. What I'm doing here is peeled off the underfluff, and now I've got my feather. Got a nice tie-in point ready. What I'll do is I'll cut that and give myself a nice little tie-in spot there. Present that to the fly. Get that tied in. Now when I tie in feathers, I like to wrap a good amount of the material forward, and then I'll wrap it back, and then that just really makes sure that that's not going to pull out. What I'll do here as well is use my scissors, kind of bend these fibers. Anytime you're wrapping in like mallard or any kind of duck feathers or stiffer feathers, the challenge is how you get them to lay back, and I really think using those scissors will really help you lay those materials back. As you can see, that one wants to go forward, so hold it back as I wrap forward. And I don't really have a set number of how many wraps I'm going to do. I usually like to look and see, you know, how the fly's looking. With things like, you know, these teal feathers and duck feathers and anything with some variegation, you know, not so much using it for support, although it will support the wing that we're going to be putting on here. I'd like it because it has a lot of color variation, and I see it more of an attractor, and makes it a little bit more lifelike. And we ended up using most of that feather. I'll just be cutting out a little bit of it, but you can see that really gives it a nice, attractive, realistic look. And I'm really kind of over the top with tying stuff in, but I really want to make sure that that's not going to fall out. Give it a little bit of a brush to kind of break up some of those feather or fibers and kind of let it lay out nicely. And a couple more wraps. Cool. So that's looking pretty excellent here. What we'll use next here, a little bit of extra select craft fur. That's another Hareline product. Use it a lot like you would any other fur product. You know, it doesn't have to be a ton of fur here. You don't want to overdress it. You want to allow the fly a chance to swim. So I've got a bit ready to cut off here, and I'm really going to make sure that I cut this really close to the pelt. Of course, it's called a pelt. It's not really a pelt because it's not a real animal, but cut it close to the pelt that they give you, and you can see about how much I've got there. I will pull out the underfur on this one that does have some shorter underfur like natural fur. I'll also make sure that you know, any really long ones, I'll pull some of those out so it's not crazy. And as far as the length of this, you know, I'm really looking to for something just beyond that hook. You know, this craft fur won't really get terribly bogged down as far as, you know, it's not going to get too fouled in that hook. I'm going to look for something about an inch beyond that. Then at my tie-in point, of course, I'll cut a nice straight line. I'm going to do that over my trash, of course. Get a nice straight tie-in point. When you remove that underfur, it's going to make sure that you're not going to be tying in a bunch of bulk. And I like to tie that right in on top, kind of like a traditional Atlantic salmon type fly. We'll tie that in on top. You know, I'll spread it out a little bit with my thumb, so it should look something like that. And you'll see we've got some butt ends that we'll kind of use to help secure this fly, and we'll tie that forward. I like to end those butt ends right at the base where those eyes are. Wrap forward, then we're wrapping back. You see we got a little bit of, couple hairs hanging out there, not a big deal. Alright. One thing you want to make sure, be careful of, is when you're brushing this back not to stick yourself with that hook. Get that wrapped in nicely. Next thing we'll do, we're going to create a dubbing loop, and my all-time favorite tool, and I use this on most every fly I tie. This is an OPST dubbing spinner. It's pretty heavy. It spins hair, spins any kind of dubbing you can put in a loop really, really well and quickly, and I highly recommend you pick up one of those. I'm using 6/0 thread here, so it's fairly fragile when it comes to dubbing loops. But if you kind of get used to the technique, you'll find it's pretty easy to not bust your loops. What I'm going to do is get my thread all the way forward to about where I'll start the head of the fly, and we're going to put some rabbit fur from basically where we ended our craft fur all the way forward through the eyes and up to the head. We'll just use some regular, somewhat thicker rabbit fur. There's somewhat of a science as far as how much you're going to put in. how much you cut off your rabbit pelt here, or the skin. In this case, I'm going to use about 2 inches. It's a decent chunk. And the trick to tying in rabbit fur into a loop is you want to get your fingers wet and straighten out all this fur so it's 90 degrees to that leather piece, and we'll get that all nice and straight. You can also, wax it. Sometimes waxing your thread will help as well, but relatively straight from that pelt or fur. Get a little bit wetter here, and get our loop ready. We'll put that in our loop, and like I said, it's a little tricky with rabbit fur. A lot of times people use a Pettigene magic tool, Mark Pettigene, but in this case, what I'm going to do is kind of gauge the length of the hair I want, and make sure these are about 90 degrees relative to your dubbing loop. And what I'll do is I'll carefully cut that fur off, and you want to make longer cuts. You don't want to disturb too much of that fur, otherwise it could tend to pull that out. Alright, so just make sure. Alright, and if you're holding down on your dubbing tool and kind of holding that loop relatively tight, you'll have a fairly easy time doing this. Best thing with this tool is you essentially pinch your line, or your thread, and then you take this tool. You'll take this tool, got your line pinched, or you'll spin it, and then as you start to feel tension on your thumb, then you'll start to release it, and you'll see that thing spins up nicely. Once you got it pretty well spun, and once again we're using 6/0, so it's fairly fragile at this point. You want to really kind of take your time. I'm using a golf club cleaning tool as my dubbing brush, but it works out really nicely. Alright, we'll get that all taken care of. Next thing, you'll moisten that fur, and we'll pull that fur back, kind of like wrapping any kind of hackle. We'll do a couple wraps behind these eyes. And we'll wrap a couple behind the eyes, and now what we'll do is we'll go to the front of the inside of the eye on the left side, back behind the eye on the right side, and now we're in front of the eyes, and we will wrap that forward to about where that head's going to be. You'll see you got quite a nice bit of fur up front. I really prefer to do most of my rabbit furs this way. I feel like unless you're using rabbit fur as a tail, it really cuts down on the bulk in your fly, makes them a lot more castable, especially if you're casting these pretty far. You don't have that wet rag feel that you're going to get from a big long piece of rabbit, or a big thick piece of rabbit skin. What I like to do with this, my tie-ins here especially, I like to wrap it like 3 times around that dubbing loop, wrap it forward towards the eye of the hook, and I'll pull everything back, including this dubbing loop back, and I'm going to wrap backwards towards that fur, and I'll pull some of that fur back, and I'll actually wrap on top of that fur. Another one of those security measures where I'm going to actually secure that dubbing loop in there, cut my dubbing loop off, make sure not to cut your thread, and then we'll finish off with a whip finish. I like to do my whip finishes from the eyes forward, so we'll do 4 or 5 turns from the eyes going forward. This kind of builds a nice tapered head. Sometimes I'll do a couple right on top of each other and then go forward. Usually 2 whip finishes is great. You don't have to use any kind of head cement or lacquer for this, but I've been using a lot of Loon products lately. The UV clear fly finish and the flow, and that's great for securing that thread and keeping everything kind of from falling apart. Once again, another one of those things that I kind of preach is making real nice durable flies. What I'm doing here is just kind of brushing out some of that rabbit fur if there's any trapped underneath there, and then I'll do a little bit of brushing backwards to forwards, get that thing nice and all those fibers broken apart. And now, without stabbing myself with a hook, I'm just going to pull that head material back, get my fingers wet, make sure that rabbit fur doesn't get too much gunk on it from this loon UV. And I'll just give it a couple touches on that thread. You can see I like to use the rotational portion of my vise. That gives me an opportunity to coat the whole thing. And then what I'll do is I'll take my fingernail and I'll just kind of flick the head of that fly, and what that's going to do is bust out any of that goop that was in the eye. So now I've got a clean eye, my head's all varnished and ready for some UV light. Of course, I got the loon UV light here. Shine that on there, and I use my rotational function here once again. About 15 seconds. Kind of, make sure you got your head all nice and varnished. And once again, guys, if you're swinging for trout, I would almost guarantee this fly will work for you anywhere in the country that you've got trout that are extremely hungry. It's light, easy to cast. I use a lot of switch rods. Real light. The bead chain, isn't going to weigh it down a lot. I do use some pretty heavy sink tips, but with light flies, definitely worth a shot. It's a super easy fly to tie. Give you one last good look at it here. We'll get it nice and slicked out. And let's see. There it is. Thanks for watching, guys.